thank you all so much for coming. My name is Dillon Smith. I lead our energy and environment work here at the Center for Policy Studies. As I'm sure or hope most of you know, 2024 is the 50th anniversary of the CPS, and we are celebrating by revisiting some of our best reports throughout the decades, one of which is this pamphlet, published by the CPS in 1985. And I've been told I have to be very careful with it because it's our only paper copy left. Published by a young man called Andrew Sullivan, who argued that the Conservatives should embrace environmentalism. That young man, of course, went on to be one of America's best-known political observers and writers of the last few decades. Best known for his political blog, The Daily Dish, and now, of course, his excellent Substack, The Weekly Dish.
Thank you.
We have a fantastic panel to discuss what green conservatism means and how it's changed. I'm going to put this down to be careful. So Sir Christopher Chope has been the MP for Christchurch since 1997 and Southampton Itchen before that, and held ministerial posts in the Thatcher and the Major governments, including a spin in the Environment Department. Now sits on the Environmental Audit Committee. Jennifer Powers was number 10 Special Advisor on Business, Regulation, Trade and Energy Policy in the Johnson government, and now works for hydrogen developer Meld Energy. And Sam Hall is the Director of the Conservative Environment Network, the parliamentary caucus for Green Tory MPs, and a tireless campaigner on the environment. So, to kick off, I'm of course going to read a quote from the report, which the conclusion succinctly summed up Andrew's argument. His central point was, and I quote, "The green issue will not go away. The correct and healthy Tory reaction is to expropriate it. Moreover, one doesn't have to be so cynical about it. Indeed, the environment is essentially a conservative issue springing from conservative sentiments. It is not a liberal or intellectual abstraction, but a detailed and humane reality. As conservatives, it is our natural territory." So, Andrew, over to you. Would love to get your thoughts on what motivated this report and the extent to which you think the conservative movement in the last 40 years has taken up the mantle.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's incredibly flattering to come back and talk about this. And I love doing it. I was hammering it out at Harvard my first year in grad school there. And it's not the classic policy paper. It's kind of an essay, really. My goal was to just philosophically shift the way conservatives thought about the environment. I mean, it really is true that back then, to mention the environment meant you were a hippie, basically. There was a cultural, visceral conservative ooh to the environment. And yet, when you looked around at the English, they were obsessed with the environment. They loved their countryside. They tended to their gardens. They were obsessed with local buildings. They loved the local tree. They loved the environment. And the person who really clued me in on that, believe it or not, was George Orwell. He wrote this lovely little book called Coming Up for Air, which I don't know whether you've read, but it's a lovely book. And in it, there's a rage against building through the green belt, basically what would have been the green belt. This is from the 30s. And there was a phrase in it where the protagonist has some monologue of ranty monologue where he says, "They tell me I prefer trees to men." He says, "Well, I say, what trees, which men?" And I also, as a kid, I was very lucky to live at the end of a road in Sussex, which ended in fields and woodlands. And one reason I'm thrilled to come, I'm going there tomorrow actually, is because the bluebells are out right now. And in Sussex, the very early spring right now, when there's tiny, virulently green new leaves, then there's the carpet below. It's the most extraordinary. And I didn't have the happiest of home lives, and I spent a lot of time in the summer out there in those places. And maybe it's just, my inheritance of grim West Irish loneliness, but I felt very much at peace there. I loved it, and I felt very traumatized when bulldozers came in and ripped it up. It was just a very visceral response. Now, of course, I also understood you have to grow, you have to work, and that was you have to build an economy. We have to build houses. We have to build many more houses, given the growth in population. But the idea that you should do so without any concern for how it affects our environs was really really horrible. Is that what? Oh, someone's. Hold on.
I think it might be.
Stop it. Oh. Please go. Yeah, I'll call you back. Sorry, go away. Go away. Sorry, I'm so sorry. How did that happen? So we should reframe it. The question of what you would do or how you do this should be extraordinarily pragmatic. It was, at the time, there was a lot of excitement about cap and trade, about market mechanisms to get private companies to reduce their pollution by marketing. Well, you know this. And that was the craze for a while. It turns out it worked in some places and worked so well in many other places. If I look back and think of pragmatically what we failed to do, and I think pragmatically nuclear is the great missed opportunity of the last 50 years. Yeah. I have this nightmare scenario in which there'll be future historians who write, the 20th century saw humankind confronted with this terrible problem that its success in industry had created so much carbon dioxide that it was heating the world. But luckily, just in time, they found a technology that could power the world without any carbon dioxide whatsoever. And then they just threw it away, pretended they hadn't done it, and nuclear power was left as a sort of orphan, except in France. So it was about recasting the argument. It was about understanding the English. It was about understanding it as a concrete human thing rather than abstract theoretical thing. And I think finally it was also about the human need for beauty. The conservatives shouldn't, I mean, I don't think conservatives, properly speaking, should ever think of humans as just economic units. We have souls too, and the way in which modern society has created so much ugliness, so much noise, and so much grey, and so little moonlight, actually does matter. This is a real quality of life question. It's what makes life worth living. And to attend to that should be politically very popular as well. And also that also involves the actual physical environment, which means the notion that architecture is to make grand statements by architects, to create unparalleled new shapes and forms, as opposed to providing beautiful homes that people actually want to live in, that will look as good in 100 years' time as they do now. It was, growing up in 70s Britain was particularly brutal. All you saw was the beauty of the past and the unbelievable ugliness of the present. And this is where Roger Scruton also played an incredibly important role in reminding us that what makes conservatism is its humaneness, its desire to remain in the actual rather than the abstract, its love of what is, its grief at what is lost, and the ability to live life with some kind of composure. And that composure means some balance between urban and rural, and between work and play, and with any luck, beauty. And so I was really lucky. They banked on me and said, "Go ahead, write this thing." I think it kind of died a death at the time. And we had a nice op-ed in the Daily Telegraph, I remember, because I remember editing it. Here I go, editing it. That's my typewriter gesture, from New Orleans. And I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who was head of CPS back then, who got me to do this.
David Willits?
Not David, no. It was anyway, a charming man who had a slight Tory disdain for the economic sort of Homo economicus that was wandering around in the early 80s, in terms of the need to get rid of all these fancy notions of romanticism and agrarianism and all the rest of it. Anyway, thank you. That's where it came from.
Fantastic opening gambit. All right, to the rest of the panel, sort of reflections on the journey the Conservative Party has been on the environment and what it means today.
Well,
Andrew, I don't think your pamphlet fell on stony ground, because it was only 1 year after that, in 1986, that I was lucky enough to be appointed by Margaret Thatcher to be a minister in the Department of the Environment, when Nick Ridley was the Secretary of State. And Nick Ridley encapsulated in his views all the values which you articulate in your pamphlet. And he was a very great believer in the importance of preserving the green belt, not because it was green, but because it allows a breathing space between conurbations. And he was absolutely insistent that efforts to try and erode greenbelt policy should be strongly resisted. He was also, as a descendant of Edward Lutyens, he was also very keen on beauty and architecture. And I can remember attending with him a seminar in, I think, Admiralty House, where he was proposing, in a radical way, as he often did, a challenging way, he was suggesting that the planning system should be more concerned with what buildings look like rather than the use to which they were being put. And some people may remember that he designed fresh gates in those days Downing Street didn't have any gates, and on the back of some cabinet meetings he designed some new gates for Downing Street. A superb design, sadly never implemented and accepted, but he was a believer in the beauty of the environment and wanted to ensure we had the very best. Bringing us right up to date, conservative values for the environment, I think, are still reflected today. This very day, I've received a circular letter from the Department for Transport Ministers talking about sustainable aviation fuel. And what is interesting about this is that the government is announcing a consultation over the next 2 months on sustainable aviation fuel, and it's saying we're going to power a percentage, a small percentage to start off with, of our aircraft with sustainable aviation fuel, and use that as a means of helping to meet climate change targets, rather than go down the line of trying to reduce demand for aviation, which is, of course, the socialist approach to this. So this very day, I think we've got an example of a conservative approach to protecting the environment, which is to embrace new technology rather than try to restrain demand. The final point I'd make is that as a member of the Environmental Audit Committee over recent years, and as somebody who actually voted against the climate change legislation, I continue to regret that the only audit that the Environmental Audit Committee is unwilling to do is a proper audit of the costs and benefits of net zero. And I think that we are going to continue to live to regret the fact that the net zero policy came about after Mrs. May had already received her marching orders, and it was a sort of dreamt up as her legacy for the future. It wasn't properly scrutinised, and a lot of the problems which we've got today flow directly from that.
Jennifer?
Am I next? Well, I really enjoyed reading Andrew's essay. It was very much unlike any other policy paper that I've read. And there were several things in there which I found quite profound, not least when you spoke about that English greenness and linked it to the safe and the private, and talked about how natural history in England is essentially local and amateur, nature in the backyards and the local meadows, rather than the remote wilderness. And that really struck a chord with me because I live in Kew, in a very old cottage that overlooks Kew Gardens, which of course is a reservoir of seeds and plants And actually, there are 5 trees that date back from the establishment of the Botanical Gardens in 1762 that are still alive. And I attend St. Anne's Church on Kew Green, which very recently launched the Kew Institute for Theology and Gardening to look at what our vicar says is the inherent join between spirituality and our surroundings. And I think that's a really fascinating development. And I think actually harks back, or maybe your essay looks ahead to things like that. So I thought that was really interesting. I also thought that it helped explain NIMBYism. Because actually, if people see their backyards and their meadows, as you did, as an extension of their identity, if they understand the environment and nature as that which is proximate, as opposed to that which is awe-inspiring beauty, but somewhere else, then you do campaign vociferously to protect what to anybody else might look like a derelict field or car park or whatever. And so I think that certainly made me think of NIMBYs in a different way. And I think your essay actually shows the way to where conservative environmentalism and conservatism in general might go. Because it harks to a profound sense of place. And how place and identity are actually intertwined. And that is incredibly powerful. And I think as a party, if we can relearn that and we can translate that into a convincing policy platform for the 2020s and the 2030s, we can not only recover popular support, but we can govern well, which is something that we should aspire to do, not just to govern, but to govern well. Which leads me to my last point before I pass over, which is, despite that inherent connectedness between Englishness and conservatism and nature, and that profound legacy, I think conservative environmentalism has profoundly lost its way. And I think while we might share the objectives with people who are not conservatives in terms of what we want to achieve and protect, we have also swallowed pretty much wholesale the means of achieving them. And of course, someone will come up and say, oh, we had cap and trade, we had the, we've got the certificate system, we've got auctions, aren't these wonderful market mechanisms? Well, yes, to an extent. But the vast majority of what we do for the environment is through massive regulation and massive subsidy. I work in green hydrogen, so I know very well the billions that will be necessary to subsidize carbon capture and storage and hydrogen production, to say nothing of renewables and upgrades to the grid. So I do think there's an opportunity, and I hope those of us, including myself, who care greatly about the environment, can work together to actually produce a far more convincing, authentically conservative approach to the environment, which will resonate with the public, but will also not impoverish us. Because this country, unfortunately, through, in my view, a misguided groupthink and a misguided support for the Climate Change Act and its amendment, have decided to sacrifice abundance on the altar of scarcity. And nothing good comes from that. We have ceded the demise of our own prosperity and that of the developed world on the altar of net zero over everything else. And I think the Conservative Party needs to look very carefully at itself and take responsibility for the part that we as a party and as governments have played in that. Anyway, I will stop there.
Great, over to me. Thank you very much, Centre for Policy Studies, for inviting me to take part in this panel and for giving me the opportunity as well to reread Andrew's excellent report, which I read a couple of months ago. Someone else circulated it as part of CPS's 50-year anniversary. And as Jennifer's already touched on, I think the way it's written and the the way you go back to some of the great foundational texts in conservatism from for people like Edmund Burke and quote other English thinkers to really root the case for the environment in those conservative principles and those arguments, I think is brilliantly done. And I think we can trace a lot of modern conservative thinking on the environment back to those arguments. In my remarks, I wanted to touch on a couple of things. Firstly, reflecting a bit on the conservative journey on the environment since that report was published. And then secondly, perhaps touching on some of the themes Jennifer mentioned, linking to kind of how we've tackled it, the kind of approach conservatives have taken to the environment. So firstly, kind of on the journey and on the records, I think your report, Andrew, I don't think that was the first time really that conservatives had engaged on the environment. I think, as we already mentioned, Edmund Burke talked a lot about it, but you can also look in some of the records of people like Benjamin Disraeli and his river pollution legislation. Anthony Eden was Prime Minister when a lot of the Clean Air legislation was passed after the Great Smog of London. Edward Heath even sat at the Department for the Environment. So there has always been that green thread running through conservatism, I think, and so your report helps to bring that out and articulate it. But I think after your report, particularly in that latter stages of the Margaret Thatcher government, we saw a lot of leadership on the environment. Firstly, around the Montreal Protocol and the agreement to phase out CFCs to heal the hole in the ozone layer that was forming. And then lastly, when she went to the UN General Assembly in 1989 to warn about the dangers of climate change. And Margaret Thatcher was, of course, the first world leader to really put climate change on the agenda. And her intervention in the UN helped to lead to a lot of the international climate change architecture that we now have, like the IPCC, the UNFCCC, and others. So I think she's a very sort of powerful lodestar, I think, for the conservative environmental movement. Subsequent Conservative Prime Ministers, I think, have looked to build on that. To David Cameron, there's already been alluded to, made it a big part of his Conservative modernisation agenda. Theresa May with her 25-year environment plan, the net zero target, of course, furthered it. And then Boris Johnson, I think, with the net zero strategy, actually taking the goal and setting out how we're going to achieve it. And crucially getting other countries to also take action through the presidency of COP26, I think took it further. And Rishi Sunak, despite some of the rhetoric, I think has continued that policy direction broadly as is. And I'd pull out in particular three key achievements from that time. Firstly, the phase out of coal-fired power stations, which just going back 10 or so years was about 40% of the UK's electricity mix, and this year the last one closes off. Coal is the single most polluting fossil fuel, and all of that change has happened under Conservative governments. And I'd argue it's been done in an economically efficient way because our coal-fired power stations were reaching the end of their natural lives in any case, and at the same time offshore wind has ramped up significantly. We're the second biggest offshore wind generator in the world after China, again developed under Conservative governments through the Contracts for Difference. Second policy I talk about is the blue belt of marine reserves around our overseas territories, now covering an area the size of India. Some of the UK's most precious biodiversity is in those overseas territories, and these restrictions around these islands that have been put in place through the Blue Belt have helped to preserve a great amount of biodiversity for the world. And the other one I pull out is the farm subsidy changes, which actually is very interested in your comments on the Common Agricultural Policy, Andrew, in your reports, highlighting how essentially it was encouraging overproduction and damage to the environment, which I think since we've left the EU we have been able to rectify those poor incentives, instead directing payments to farmers to deliver public goods, helping them protect the environment alongside producing food. The record's not perfect. Obviously, biodiversity is still in decline. Some of the figures you cited about the hedgerows we've lost, the wildflower meadows that we've lost, I think those figures are still going in the wrong direction, but I think the policy frameworks are now being put in place that can start to turn that around. And I think the other area that I thought we'd not made as much progress on as we could have done is around buildings and improving our building stock. We still have some of the leakiest housing stock in Europe, and I think given the energy security concerns that have been raised recently, we could be doing more to talk about, to deploy some of the tax incentives around stamp duty, around landlords' tax deductions, to encourage people to retrofit their homes, make them leakier, and in the byproduct preserve the kind of built environment and heritage that we have. I wanted briefly to touch on kind of the approach, because I think your report really articulates that the kind of core conservative instincts around the environment is rooted in the local, in our communities, in our towns and in our places. And I think there's a temptation to think that the sort of focus now on climate change is sort of somehow sort of taking us away from that. But I think if we look at the impacts of climate change and why many of us are worried about climate change, the impacts that we care about are local. It's our trees, our native trees that are being affected by new pests and diseases that have been made more widespread by climate change. It's our farmland that's underwater, as we've seen this winter with more extreme rainfall. It's our coastal communities threatened by flooding and coastal erosion. It's our potholes in our roads that are now much more severe because of climate change extreme weather. So I think, the efforts to tackle climate change and the net zero goal is simply the end goal of tackling climate change and stopping it getting worse. I think does spring from exactly the same instincts that you say. So for me, it is a continuation. I would take Jennifer's point, though, that we could be doing more to use conservative policy mechanisms, things like tax incentives, planning reform, competition, free trade as well, I think is an important tool. So I think we could be doing more to deploy some of those more conservative policy solutions to hit our goals. But yes, I'll leave it there.
Great. Lovely. Well, thank you. Tons to pick up on. I suppose where I'd love to start is Andrew, back to something you mentioned. I think all of you alluded to this. Your experience of being a child and seeing the bluebell meadows that you love sort of torn out by development, I think speaks to a fundamental conflict that we face today, in that for many conservatives, the sort of introduction to the environment is in the local area, and as Sam pointed out, sort of so much of it is rooted in the local. And yet, a lot of what we need to do to hit our net zero goals is ultimately building pylons through people's fields and energy infrastructure and so on, and not at all to mention the huge housing crisis we have and the need to build more homes. There's an inherent conflict there between wanting people to care about their local environment, but also the need for development in certain bits of it. And I wonder if any of you have reflections on that, particularly from a sort of conservative and philosophical perspective, how to balance those two.
Well, Andrew had this wonderful quote from Aristotle. You remember that one?
Do you read?
And I wrote it down because I thought it was one we should all remember. And if I can see my notes. What is common to the greatest number is cared for least. Men think principally of what is their own, and if they have the common interest at heart, it is only to the extent that they are personally concerned therein. And that was, I think, a good example of the importance of not in your own backyard and the localism. And so I don't accept that we need to have great policies saying you're going to have pylons put across your beloved landscapes because of some great common cause. I think we need to be more refined about that. And so if you want to move electricity supply from one part of the country to another, then there's nothing to stop you actually putting the supply cables underground. That's the environmentally friendly way of doing it. Maybe a bit more expensive. So I would say promote the local and don't allow yourselves to be dominated by the common cause. The whole of the HS2 saga came out. What was the origin of it? It was the origin that David Cameron wanted to support Boris Johnson in finding a reason for not supporting a new runway at Heathrow. So what did he decide? He decided that instead what we're going to do is we're going to have a railway line between London and Manchester so that people don't need to come to London and to fly, and they can go by train instead. It was only and I can remember being at the seminar where this was talked about. It was only a short time before the experts started telling him that if you build a new railway line between Heathrow and Manchester, what it will do is increase the demand on Heathrow rather than reduce the demand. So what was the response? The response was to make sure that the railway line didn't terminate at Heathrow, but somewhere further away from Heathrow. But the whole ridiculous concept of it as being in the national interest and an environmentally beneficial thing was flawed from the start. And we have reaped the whirlwind on the cost of enormous waste on that. Think of all the good environmental things we could have achieved with the money that's been wasted on HS2.
Yeah.
I think the one thing no one would have anticipated in 1985 is the mass migration and therefore the big increase in population in the United Kingdom. It's much faster and bigger than people appreciated, and also the impact of the EU as well. And that, I think, provides the housing question is kind of crucial to this. Now, that means figuring out better ways to fill brownfield sites, to find places in cities where you can build more sensibly with more actual family units or even single units within particular areas. There are smart ways of doing it which don't necessarily require ripping up large amounts of the greenbelt. And, you know, I live in America, and I don't want the south of England to be Los Angeles. I don't, and it could be, absolutely could be. It's the same size roughly, and it's, you know, and it would make sense. And there are lots of lovely parts of Los Angeles. You can go to the Runyon Canyon. There's all sorts of wildlife in there, but it is. I mean, when I first went there, it just goes on forever, and I don't want the south of England to be that. But again, we're stuck with this massive new population. We do have to find housing, and I think you have to try and do it as much as you can within existing urban areas.
Yeah. Well, what to say? Look, my specialism is more on energy than environment, but I was struck by, when I was in Downing Street, I was struck by the perverse policymaking that has come from the Climate Change Act and the carbon budgets that we are that we follow. I remember we'd had an exercise where we had to crystallize what the absolute top priorities were by each department in a ill-fated attempt to give form and structure to the Boris government. And DEFRA put that their number one objective was to plant X million trees. Now, planting X million trees is great, and that's fine. But they weren't doing it because it was the right trees in the right place. They were doing it because there was a calculation that each tree reduced carbon by a certain amount, and therefore it would fit under this equation of this carbon budget that had been signed off and created by the CCC and signed off by the government. And it's a very perverse way to go about deciding where and when and how many trees to produce. And this happened all the time with everything. You went around and you'd say, why are we doing this policy in this way, which, you know, the trees are probably all going to die because they're being put in the wrong place, planted at the wrong time of year, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd say, oh, well, we have to meet our carbon budgets. So it is really putting the cart ahead of the horse. And I think we need, as a party, to be courageous enough to admit where we've gone wrong and put together a much more pragmatic offer, which is much more rooted in place. And we need to understand that actually by swallowing really the core tenets of the left, we are taking on board not only the means to those objectives, but we are swallowing what is at its heart a very anti-humane approach. You know, the reason why lots of environmentalists don't like nuclear or don't like other forms, you know, research into, you know, fusion and fission and all these things, the reason they don't want a solution is because net zero is not their objective. They want to erase the impact of humanity on the world, on the earth. And once you understand that, you think, well, no, I'm a conservative. I value human beings as well as the natural environment. And I'm about trying to make them work in harmony as much as possible. And that involves trade-offs. And therefore, I don't want to create a legally binding policy framework which actually causes all of this perverse policymaking, which, as I said, impoverishes us. I mean, I worked for the Energy Saving Trust, so I'm all for saving energy and lowering people's bills, but actually, I don't think we should be focusing on giving tax incentives to people to redo their, to upgrade their very leaky elderly homes. I think that they should be allowed to have magnificent, solid wall, brick homes, and we should leave them in peace. And we should actually put research and development into making very affordable energy. Because once you have an abundant energy supply, you can lift all of England, all of Britain out of poverty, and all of the world out of poverty. Because England is, of course, or energy is, of course, the backbone of the economy, and it's the backbone of civilization. So instead of creating all these perverse incentives, I'd actually like us to go back to square one and say, how do we, as a country, what could our contribution be to the world? Well, maybe it could be this amazing R&D from all of our scientists and all of our research institutions in creating these technologies that will allow us to create abundant energy, which will then allow us to deal with the disbenefits that are already happening from climate change, whether that's adaptation or flooding. So I just think there's something much more fundamental that needs to be addressed than speaking about little, policy issues here and there. I think we need to have a fundamental relook at the way we're approaching the environment. And I'll stop there because I fear I've gone on too much. But I just, at some point, hope we can come back to rivers. Because I think one of the most amazing things this government has done has put in monitoring of sewage overflows. Amazing, right? Like, we didn't know how much sewage these water companies were putting into rivers, right? Not only are we not getting the credit, we're being attacked as the one permitting sewage. I mean, it is an incredible own goal. So through sort of sheer incompetence of successive conservative governments, we're in the situation where we're being blamed when we're the ones that are trying to get a baseline so that we can then monitor and clamp down on the sewage. So I think, that goes back very much to a sense of place, a sense of our locality, our soil, our garden, our meadow, our chalk stream. These are things the public cares about. We see that. And who's going to benefit despite all the work that we've done on that? The Greens and the Liberal Democrats. So I don't wish to come over overly pessimistic, but I think that conservative environmentalism has gone very, very wrong.
Just to come back to your question, Dillon, on sort of housing and sort of building on the point Andrew mentioned, I think there's lots of potential for gentle densification in our cities to reduce some of the pressure on green spaces, and we can do so in a way that also enhances the beauty of our built environment. So an idea that your head of housing, Samuel Hughes, has promoted is mansard roofs and letting streets have a referendum on adding a mansard roof permission, the permitted development rights across the street, and that would help us densify some of our cities and make them look more architecturally beautiful. On some of the infrastructure we need for net zero and how we can bring people with us on that, because I think that is absolutely critical. We saw with onshore wind in England where there was a sort of overruling of local decisions on that. There was a big backlash, led to a kind of complete block on that, which I think went too far. We need to bring people with us on pylons, and I think if we're being honest about our energy supplies, because fossil fuels in the North Sea are in decline, if we want to generate energy from within our own shores, it's going to have to be renewables. That is going to require a new grid, and therefore we are going to need to bring communities with us with pylons. So I think ideas like community benefits, where communities receive a payment in return for hosting that infrastructure and the inconvenience it causes, potentially it could even go on supporting local environmental projects as well to tackle some of the damage. I think I could go into all the carbon budget stuff. I think I'll just make two quick points. One on R&D and how I completely agree with the importance of R&D and how that could be a major contribution of the UK. I think the lesson we've seen with things like offshore wind is how those things have become cheap and desirable for other countries is through deployment. So, we shouldn't forget the sort of deployment bit of R&D. Economies of scale are really crucial for getting the cost down. And so I think, we shouldn't just do R&D, we should actually deploy some of this stuff at scale. And the other point on carbon budgets, I think, there is there is a kind of science around climate change and a certain amount of concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, causing trigger points. We can't sort of wait too long to do R&D and to hold off on lots of these things. So I think carbon budgets are just butting against the reality of kind of when we need to tackle these things if we're going to avoid incredibly expensive impacts and all the damage to our local communities and areas that we love that we kind of talked about. For me, conservatism is about being pragmatic and dealing with the world as it is.
Absolutely.
And of course, I would love that climate change weren't happening, but it is. And so we kind of have to act on it on a certain timescale. And carbon budgets really are just a device for showing us what that timescale is.
Can I just add to that the one thing we didn't fully understand when I wrote this was the impact of climate change, and that's got to make a difference. And you're right, it will affect localities too, of course, and they will be hit too. And I honestly think there's another aspect of conservatism, which is we're stewards. And we don't believe we own what we have. We believe we were given it and we're going to pass it along. And there is a moral responsibility not to be the generation that passes on a world which is becoming increasingly uninhabitable for lots of species and humans at a scale and at a pace that is simply unprecedented. And the pamphlet was an attempt to sort of get conservatives to think more creatively about this and to understand it's not against them to do this. But I also think that why I understand the issues with net zero, absolutely, and I do think there are ways in which it can be adjusted. But I'm also proud, as a former Tory, as it were, that party has presided over and taken that responsibility seriously. And when you live in the United States and you see a Republican Party absolutely not taking it seriously, I mean, they do occasionally, and they have to, like DeSantis had to in Florida, because he's facing some incredibly difficult choices in Florida. And DeSantis, in fact, has kind of got a good record on this in a very pragmatic, conservative way. But I do think that changes a lot. It does up the ante for our support for this. It has to. And I think there is a moral component to this. Where if Burke meant anything, it was that this is a contract. And we are between the past, the present, and the future. And we are breaking that contract with the future. And that is a deeply unconservative thing to do.
Yeah, well said. From my own part, one of the things that's quite interesting about and difficult about climate change is precisely those local impacts that Sam was touching on. Mostly won't be for us. Mostly will be for our children, and particularly our grandchildren. And if we don't get our act together, it will be far, far worse from them. And it's a difficult sell to voters to say, you need to do something now that will actually the majority of the benefits will accrue in 50 to 100 years down the line. And yet that is the intergenerational pitch that we essentially need to make. And it's funny, so the CPS, speaking of great CPS papers, my predecessor, Eamon Ives, wrote a wonderful paper, I think this is 2019, on carbon taxation. The free market route to net zero is put a price on every fossil fuel in the economy, do it upstream, let it filter down, let the market figure out who's going to reduce emissions and why. Of course, that's a principle behind the emissions trading scheme that we inherited from the EU and now is the UK version. But of course, it's only for certain sectors, and God forbid we apply that to individual consumers. And yet, that's not necessarily particularly popular. People don't showing them the impacts in a direct way can be difficult. And I think reasons of political expediency, in addition to standing up assets and lowering cost of capital and all that, are often reasons why ministers reach for the subsidy lever rather than the taxation lever. And yet, one of the things that I struggle with quite a bit is how we have that discussion with people about it's going to be a lot more economically efficient, but you will see the impacts. Curious for all of your thoughts on carbon taxation. Sam, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the big problems I think we face as Conservatives on that issue is that within our own tribe, there are certain free marketeers who don't accept the kind of case for a carbon tax and will attack it as an extra cost on households and on businesses. So, I think that has held it back, that there is political opposition within our own tribe and people that would sort of weaponise it. I mean, personally not supportive of the extension of the ultra-low emission zone for various reasons, but I think that was an attempt to do the polluter pays principle, arguably quite a conservative approach to it, but it's been a big conservative attack. So I think where it is always a challenge, I think, for Conservatives who want to pursue that more purist approach to climate policy of putting a price on carbon, that within our own tribe, I think we often come up against quite stiff resistance. And as you say, I think it has therefore favoured longer term mechanisms like subsidy contracts, which are legally binding and the government can't get out of if there is a big backlash from the tabloids. And, one of the reasons why the carbon price support got stopped in 2012 was because of that, and we've gone the way that we have on renewables. So I do think there are political reasons to give credit to Conservative environmentalists who I think have had to muddle through on the best way politically to deliver this agenda. And I think that they've come up against that opposition from their own side.
I don't know, is he talking about me? I'm not against carbon taxation, so go ahead.
But surely as Conservatives, we are realists, and we should recognise that whatever we do in this country, we are responsible for less than 1% of global emissions of CO2, and that we shouldn't make ourselves pursue policies which are hair-shirt policies, damaging our own economy and our ability to defend ourselves, which result in becoming ever more dependent upon China, our emerging arch enemy. And almost all the environmental policies that are being implemented at the moment are actually transferring power from us to the Chinese economy. Why are we doing that?
Well, Sir Christopher is absolutely right. And one of the things that I thought was brilliant when I was in Number 10, there was a paper written at Bayes, as it was then, on critical mineral strategy. And it was absolutely shocking to learn about how we were making ourselves incredibly dependent on China with regard to the energy transition. And again, I go back to this myopic view that affordability and energy security are secondary or tertiary to net zero, when actually you have to do them together. You have to do them in tandem. Otherwise, you end up in a very bad place. And my statistics are a year or so old, but the rare earth materials that go into batteries and solar panels and wind turbines, China has within their borders something like 36% of known reserves. Of course, we can explore more, and we should, and that's great. But they actually control 70+% of the global processing and refining of those minerals that are necessary for the energy transition. And do you know when they decided to corner the market in rare earth materials? Does anyone have a guess?
Early 2000s.
No. Anybody else? 1975, yes. 1975, 1976. Absolutely. They decided at their annual, budgetary meeting that they would do. I mean, amazing. Phenomenal strategic thinkers, right? We are absolutely asleep at the wheel. I agree that renewables and the opportunity for tidal, for instance, hugely expensive, but, we could be such a leader in that. Phenomenal opportunities there. But, shale gas. Why are we not making use of the energy that's under our feet? We are freeloading on the Americans, right? We freeloaded on Norway and all of their North Sea, and they'll continue to sell it to us. We're freeloading on the U.S. Before that, it was the Middle East, and I think it's a deeply dangerous attitude. But I also think it's deeply immoral. It's like the fact that we recycle things, even though they can't be widely recycled because there's not a market. So they get shipped to the Far East, and then they get put in the rivers. And, the people in these third world countries have to basically live in our rubbish, with our rubbish, because we've decided we're going to export our rubbish to elsewhere instead of dealing with it ourselves, because we won't burn it, despite the fact the Swiss do it. But that's a whole different conversation. So I guess I just feel like this is time for honesty in our approach to the environment and our approach to energy. And I don't think that making use of shale gas or continuing to explore the North Sea reserves, although it's a declining oil field, but there's still more there, I don't think that it's binary. I don't think we do that or invest in nuclear or tidal or offshore. I think we do all of it, and I regret that under a succession of Conservative governments that we have contributed to the decline of the North Sea, that we haven't been brave enough to speak up and make the most of our shale gas reserves, and that we seem to be ruling out deep sea mining, which I find a phenomenal development, which seems to have sort of passed under the radar, considering that we need to make use of Earth's resources to improve the prosperity, not just of ourselves, but of everyone.
Lovely. Lots more I would love to talk about, Sam, unless there's anything more you want to add.
I mean, other just briefly on shale, as we're going there. I mean, I do think actually successive Conservative governments threw an awful lot at shale. I mean, remember the was it Theresa May's manifesto that had a larger section on shale gas than it had on the environment. You know, lots of, and then obviously Liz Truss's government again had a
better not mention
had a big push on it as well, and it had quite a fractious outcome. And speaking to a lot of MPs with local residents who are very concerned about the local environment, to kind of bring it back to the to bring it back to the kind of theme of the pamphlet. Didn't like the natural environment impacts. I mean, I think there's not a huge amount to get worked up about on climate grounds around fracking, but I think just politically for the Conservative Party, it has been tried. A lot of political capital has been expended on it, and we've not had any shale gas, and the sort of size of the prize is, I think, still pretty hotly disputed. So go for the stuff that has worked. The stuff we've built a lot of in the last year that's come down in cost a lot is offshore wind. I think we should do nuclear as well, and the government is doing that, but challenge getting the private sector there. So that would be my one comment on shale.
Yeah, fair. Glad we can all agree on doing more nuclear.
Yes.
Yes. Right, we are running past time, but we'd love to open up for a bit of Q&A. Great, we'll take questions sort of 3 at a time, so 1, 2, and then 3 in the back.
Mark Sullivan, CPRE West Midlands region, just say to Conservative Environment Network that when it gets lobbied by the CPRE National Office, they're the left-leaning people. They're much more right-leaning people in the membership. But it has 40 different charities, so there are like the Girls 246 varieties of cheese. It's not a single view. I do like Andrew Sullivan's paper, and I remember it coming out.
Wow.
I do think you were a little hard on the Germans at the time, and it's a wonderful bit you wrote. But Germans, comparing it with England, I understood it, but now they are particularly very good at environment. And only 4 years after you wrote, the Berlin Wall came down, and it revealed to us a largely unspoiled landscape of East Germany, which was like driving in the 1990s, driving through a Battsford 1930s England, except in a modern car with modern shops, modern stuff in the shops.
Sorry,
Really
can we get to your question?
What I wanted to put to the Environment Network, though, was this point, and it probably goes to bright blue and Britain remade if they're more than one-man bands, which is, I think we need to consider, is it possible to build more infrastructure? We have a National Infrastructure Commission and an Infrastructure and Promote Projects Authority. I don't know what they do. But please consider this country is now so full and so many people are preserving their areas that it's not going to be possible to put down another layer of pylons over England. We saw what happened with HS2.
All right,
Okay.
I think we get
Point
the
made.
question.
So really
Jeff,
I
can you-
wanted to put that to the Environment Network,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you. We're going to take questions 3 at a time, so.
Thank you very much. Will Lane, Conservative Councillor in Kensington, Chelsea. I agree with what you said about the correlation between energy use and civilisation. And my question is very much in that vein. What can we do in the UK to encourage private sector investment in nuclear fusion and attract the best and brightest here to the UK? And how are we doing compared to our peers like Japan, Taiwan, the US? Thank you.
Lovely. Question all the way in the back.
Hi, a quick one. Why do there's the environment movement and particularly conservatives say so little about adaptation versus mitigation?
Yeah.
And second, I really appreciate Andrew to reflect on any lessons from his magnificent gay marriage campaign. And in some ways you could say that kind of debate is now reflected in the environmental. So it seems like the temper of conservative politics on the environment has not become all that conservative, not just the policy solutions, but the temper of it.
All right, to the panel, any of the three questions?
Shall I go first? Yeah, on can we build more infrastructure? I mean, I think the answer is we have to, because we've got a whole load of retiring energy capacity. We do have a growing population. We do have, growing needs of the economy, like data centres that need more energy. So I think we unfortunately, we do have to build more electricity generation. I think if we can deal with some of the basics by making them more efficient, for example, insulating our homes, that obviously reduces the pressure on building more infrastructure, could save us some money. That seems to me a good thing to do, but I do agree with Jennifer that we should also be aiming as much as possible to get to that state of clean energy abundance, and I think we will get there, but it might take us some time, and obviously we've got to bring communities with us as well as we build it. So yeah, that would sort of tie together those 2 points.
Jennifer, Andrew?
Absolutely agree with adaptation, and actually I think that links back very much to that quintessential English understanding of the environment, and I think would go down very well. And when you look at the number of local flooding groups there are, as you go around the country, there's a huge amount of local effort that goes into that, and also the river watch groups with regard to the sewage. These are things that people care about deeply. I do agree with Sam that we need to build more infrastructure. I do agree with community benefit for a whole range of infrastructure investment. Nuclear is a really interesting one, and it goes to my topic of another day, and I think another event you had around regulation. So I shan't get started, but I will give you an anecdote, which is I met some international innovators in nuclear on AMR and SMRs and different types of nuclear technology, German and Canadian and from all parts of the world. And it was interesting because very few of them were looking to build their demonstrations here in the UK. Despite the fact that we now, we have had, actually under Boris, one of his great achievements was getting nuclear going again and creating Great British Nuclear. And, I'm full of praise for him in what he did there, and actually on grid infrastructure as well, just to give him another plug. He was fascinated and obsessed with upgrading the network. So can't fault him on that. But I asked one of these company directors, well, where are you doing your nuclear demonstration plant for this new technology? He said, Africa. Yeah. Because here, instead of saying it's a new technology, therefore we need to create a blueprint that is proportionate to the risk that this new technology brings, we say, oh, what tweaks can we make to the existing regulation for existing nuclear? And it's just completely the wrong way to go about it. But there's so much inertia in the system, and there's, everything is geared toward just iterating on the existing model that you never actually address the fundamental issues. So my view is you actually have to start from scratch. And if you did that, a bit like investment zones and these areas where we say we're not going to have these rules. If you just say no, new nuclear, we're creating this new from scratch proportionate regulation. The other thing more broadly is to create regulatory reform across all the sectors. So that probably involves regulatory reform of the regulators to have outcome-based rather than process-based regulation. Because at the moment it's tick box over process as opposed to regulating for risk as opposed to regulating on process, which is very time-consuming and why very few people want to actually bring these wonderful technological marvels to the UK.
Lovely. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say something, the adaptation point, which is a really good one. I like the term that so much of successful politics, as it were, is about framing things right and finding a way to describe policy. And one of them was resilience, which is a kind of, gives you that sort of gritty sense that we can withstand shifts and changes. I live in Cape Cod, on Cape Cod, on pilings in the sand. So it is extremely clear to me that time is running out. On the marriage and this issue, so funny, there's two things I wrote in the 80s have sort of lingered longer in the atmosphere. It was much easier because marriage equality, it just means it's a simple change of the law. This is an immensely more complicated and difficult subject, but I do think that the goal of reframing it and finding a way to appeal to people when they were really shut off from it is just as successful, actually. And it's incredibly good to see Tories understanding that, and as well as being realistic and hard-headed about how you get there, which is part of what we want Conservatives to be too. We want them to be both conservative, but we also want them to be ruthlessly pragmatic and realistic about what we can do. I don't take your view that because the Chinese are screwing everything up, we should just give up and die. Something like that. Well, anyway, I'm obviously dramatically caricaturing your position. But the reason that argument doesn't quite fully work is that if you can get somewhere, it spreads. And I personally think this is probably going to be solved by some technological breakthrough.
Absolutely.
And all of the above needs to be experimented with.
Yeah.
But I do think it's, as I said before, a generational challenge that we can't run from.
Well, if you take the view that we can't stop global warming, then what we should be doing is learning to live with the consequences of global warming, which is another way of saying we should adapt to that changing situation. So I'm all in favour of adaptation. Adaptation, however, is a dirty word amongst the purist zealots because they see adaptation as being used by those of us who are sceptical about the whole global warming agenda. They see us as using adaptation as a means of avoiding the need for suppression of individual liberty and wrecking the lives of families in this country on the altar of the climate change zealots. But if you look at it, for example, the Thames Barrier, that's a really good example of adaptation, investing in the recognition of the fact that there's likely to be tidal surges which could, unless we take preventative action and adapt, cause London to have a really serious flooding event. That's where we should be investing our resources rather than pointless subsidies in making gestures to the Chinese who are not interested in our gestures.
Well, on that very uplifting note,
I think should we not give Andrew the final word?
Actually, that's a very good point.
No.
My final word is to thank you all for inviting me back.
Oh, yeah.
And just to reiterate, and I've said in policy studies, one of the things I really do believe, and I've learned from experience, ideas matter.
Yes.
They really do matter.
Absolutely.
And keeping those ideas fresh and keeping those traditions fresh is important work. It really is. And you can easily lose your way. And so CPS, for me, was a wonderful opportunity and changed Britain, I think, for the better, and still can.
Yay.
Can I just add, I was a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies when you wrote that paper.
Wow.
And I well remember meeting you. And I can't, it's so important to stress how innovative your study was. And I had, you say it didn't seem to have had much of an impact, but I had cabinet ministers like Kenneth Baker coming up to me 2 months after we published that study saying, that's a fantastic study. And, really, really interested. You set off a...
Thank you.
You deserve that praise.
I didn't notice. I was all the way over there.
I think it was Jeremy Sherman, the gentleman?
Yeah, I think you're right, yes.
Who was Karl Popper's assistant at the LSE. So that's
And a charming
That's the
man,
connection.
a charming man who was interested in stirring things up a little bit. He was great. Yeah.
All right, well, we'll end it there. If you want to know more about regulation, which Jennifer was beautifully plugging, we put out a paper on the future of regulation.
Yay.
That we'll be doing an event just in this room next Wednesday. Hopefully all of you can make it.